Well, having dealt with all those pesky alternatives that white can spring on us when we play d5, we're now going to move on to the Queen's Gambit. And I'm going to recommend the Queen's Gambit accepted with d takes c4. Again, it's my perception, and this is based on a substantial amount of observation of club players, that the Queen's Gambit accepted is one of the lesser known variations at that level. At higher levels, the Queen's Gambit accepted is a very respectable choice. It's been used in World Championship matches. It was even used by Kasparov when he was playing against Kramnik in one of his matches. It was used extensively in the 60s in the Petrosian-Botvinnik matches, and it has a long history of satisfactory results for black. It's a nice fluid opening. Black has clear ideas in mind. I don't think the Queen's Gambit accepted is a particularly difficult opening to play, so I can strongly recommend it to you. Now, there are many lines that white can play. As usual, we're going to take a look at the main line where white plays knight f3, and the main point of that move is to restrain black from playing the freeing break e5. For instance, if we go back against e3, which is another move here, we will see that black can play satisfactorily with e5. Moreover, if white plays e4, which is one of the sharpest moves, again I'll be recommending that black play with e5, simply because it's just straightforward, and that's the way club players should play. They must learn to walk before they can run, if you like. So now to the Queen's Gambit accepted. White plays knight f3 to restrain e5. Black plays knight f6. White goes e3. Black goes e6. White plays bishop takes c4. And now the main line is simply to play c5. White castles. Then comes a6. That's another key move in the Queen's Gambit accepted. And we reach a crucial point here where white has to decide whether he's going to play a4 or he's going to let black play b5. Well, in my first game comes from the Hungarian Championship in 2008 between Grandmasters Sebe and Balogh. Balogh at this time was 2-6-2-4. Sebe was 2-4-8-0. I've taken a few liberties with the move order here. The two players actually adopted a slightly different move order to reach this position. I wanted to show you the absolute main line. White played Queen e2, allowing black to play b5 in this game. We're going to see many examples of white playing a4 a bit later on, Botvinnik's move. Bishop b3, bishop b7, black brings his rook to d1, we go knight b d7 blocking the file, knight c3, and this is, I would say, the start of the absolute main line of the Queen's Gambit accepted, where black has several choices. Black can play Queen to c7 in this position. That's been popular with Grandmasters. He can play bishop d6. That's also been popular with Grandmasters. But in this game, Balogh played what I think is, well, my favourite move here, Queen to b8. And that's the move I'll be recommending to you on this DVD. Now, the first point of Queen d8 is to reserve the c-square for the bishop, should that become necessary. Black's main plan is simply to play bishop d6 in this position, with strong and coherent development. And to show you that black's position cannot be shaken by very violent means, let's take a look at this miniature where white ventured e4. Now, as soon as he does that, and that's one of the reasons why he puts his queen on e2, to be able to support the advance e4, black should destroy the centre with e takes d4. The point is that after knight takes d4, we're going bishop d6. So it's a question really of whether white can shape black's position here. If he can't, then black will obviously have a very good game indeed. I've won many games myself in the Queen's Gambit accepted. With these raking bishops, you can often start an attack against the white king. And indeed, in this position, we note that already this pawn on h2 is under fire. And in fact, that little detail in the position completely freaks Sebe out, because he plays the very strange looking move f4. I don't know whether he thought he was being clever playing this move, whether it was some tactical stroke of genius, but it really doesn't work out too well. But what is white going to play in this position? It's not that easy. If he blocks with g3, black has two satisfactory moves. He can play knight c5, or he can simply castle, given that f4 is going to be met with e5. White's problem is that although he's got this impressive knight, his king position is very loose, and that pawn on e4 is a definite target for black to attack. So black is absolutely fine here. We'll see more of this a little later on, but for the time being, let's have a look at f4. What on earth is White's idea? Why can't black just take the pawn? And that was probably the question Balor was asking himself, because he chopped on f4 twice. There's also knight g4 in the offing. I mean, if you ever get a position like this with black, you know, you have to say to yourself, well, I haven't done anything wrong. If White's got some fantastic combination up his sleeve, then good luck to him. But otherwise, black is just winning. Black's going to castle and put a knight on e5, and that's the end of the game, more or less. So White tried to continue to justify his energetic move f4 by the equally energetic, but perhaps, again, slightly misguided move, bishop takes e6. Black took, and now knight takes e6. So this is obviously the idea, to try to blow black apart in the opening. Well, I mean, it's just not going to work. Black played queen to e5. Very good move. In general, control of e5 is important for black in this line, and you should always try to establish control of that square. Certainly if you get control of this type, then you can consider the game to be very favourable indeed for you. Well, Seve continued his tour of the black king side with knight takes g7 check and knight f5. So counting the pawns here, we see that White's got 2 pawns for a piece, and he seems to have opened up the black king. The problem is that black has chances on the king side himself, and Balog tried to emphasise these with rook g8. A very half-hearted looking move by White, a3. Now came the real deal. Black played knight g4. After g3, there came knight df6, and after h3, but I mean, I think already White's getting into desperate trouble here. Black's idea is probably just to swing his rook across and put pressure on e4. h3, knight h6, and already White had to recognise that his attack was not only broken, it was black who was now in the ascendancy attacking wise. Well, Seve resigned this position. The problem is his king side is falling completely apart. Knight h6 decoys the knight from f5 away from the defence of g3. If White goes g4, well, I mean, I think we can just keep it simple if we want to by exchanging off the knights. That would be simple enough, I suppose, something like this. If you want to keep it simple, there should be other ways to break open the white position there. Some sort of sacrifice on g4 is starting to look very strong as well. So rather than see these variations on the board, Seve resigned. So just to recap, in the main line, after d4, d5, c4 takes, knight f3, restraining black from playing e5, knight f6, the freeing break c5, the probing move a6, and we're looking at lines where White plays down the absolute main line. Nice fluid development for black, and then the key move, queen to b8. Our preliminary game shows that black should be getting good chances with this interesting move. Well, there now comes a very interesting game in the main line of the Queen's Gambit Accepted between Volkmar Dinstoel, who's grades 2416, and the Dutch Grandmaster Erik van den Doel. And this game was played in the Bundesliga in 2003. We were looking at the main line after knight f3. In this game, Van den Doel played e6. That kind of invites White to play e4. I prefer knight f6 in this position, but nevertheless, we quickly get to what we want, as after a6, bishop takes c4, c5 castles, knight f6, we came back into the main line. And we're looking at the line where, the absolute main line, where White allows black to play b5, then he plays his bishop to b7, his knight to d7, and then he plays his queen to b8. Of the 10th move alternatives for black, I kind of like this one. You don't put your queen on an exposed square, you prepare bishop to d6, and you retain quite a few options by this method. But of course the critical variation which we're now going to see in this particular game is the one where White breaks in the centre with d5, and this is a good test of black's resources in this line. Now when White plays forward in the centre like this and you haven't castled, it's wise to respond modestly. You can't be playing too ambitiously in this position. For instance, if you start playing moves like c4, you could well get blown away, or at least have to suffer some sort of impediment in your pawn structure after d takes e6. No, that's not what you should be doing. So this is why Van der Doel followed theory here and traded all the pieces on d5. Of course, what happens in this line is that it would be unwise for black to play bishop d6, because that would just give white a lot of tactical ideas down the d file, and it would mean that if white simply developed his pieces, at some stage he'd be able to swing his rook across to d1, backing up the other rook, and then black's pieces would be in a mess. So Van der Doel plays modestly with bishop e7, and I believe this is the right way to do it. And of course now white plays e4, which is the main point of this variation. We'll reach a position, as I say, where this is all theory. Black's got to be careful. His next move does the trick. It's knight b6. It's definitely worth casting our eye over this position and mentioning black's queenside pawn majority. This is a very useful feature of the position. Of course, to counterbalance that, white has got a majority of pawns in the centre and on the king side. Usually when the pawn structure is like this, and black is almost certainly going to castle short in this position, black plays for endgames because his pawn majority is distant from the white king. White tries to stay in the middle game and fashion some sort of an attack against the black king. So this already is quite a critical position. Now, in this particular game that we're featuring, Dinstall went rook to d1. Now, there have been some games where white went rook to h5, and this is the type of scary looking move which would give a lot of club players a heart attack. The game Ostenstadt versus Morovic-Fernandez went rook h5 castles, bishop e3. We'll see this move e5 next. Then Morovic-Fernandez went queen to c8. White went rook to c1. Black played g6, rook h3. Queen came across to g4. Bishop took on c5. Rook came to c8. And now white played queen to e3. Well, with hindsight, perhaps he should have played a move like b4. But black is pretty well coordinated if he takes this bishop and then plays his knight to a4, something like this. White's pieces are kind of sprayed out all over the board. In the game, after queen e3, black took on c5 twice and claimed a slight advantage, presumably because of after queen takes c5, we can go queen takes e4. Black went on to win this game. Now, if I come back to the original idea of rook h5 castles, what about the move e5? That was played in the game Vogt versus Heinbuch, Germany, 1984. There again, black played this useful move, queen c8, taking the white squares, and after queen e4, threatening mate g6, and after rook h3, the queen came to e6. White pressed ahead with his intended kingside attack. Black played f5. Queen came over to h4. Rook f7, sturdy defence. Rook came to d1, rook to e8. Bishop takes e7. Rook f takes e7. With every exchange, black's position, I think, becomes better. And note here that knight g5 is answered by queen takes e5. White hasn't got time to take on h7 in view of the back rank mate. So that's why Vogt went g3 in this position. But after rook d7, rook e1, black was better and went on to win in 32 moves. Going back then to knight b6, let's return to our game where white played rook d1, black castled, e5, and again black played this idea of queen to c8. Well, what does white play in this position? If he goes bishop g5, we go queen e6. This looks pretty good for black to me, something like this. Takes, rook d6, knight c4. Black is fine. So white in the game played queen to c2, and now black played a very good move here, very useful, pawn up to h6, snuffing out white's attack. And if white hasn't got an attack in this position, a direct attack, then the most compelling feature of the position is, as I've stated, this queenside pawn majority. That's what you've got to make work for you in this line. Well, Dinstall, recognising the situation, the fact that he had to perhaps restrain the queenside pawn majority, played with b3, queen e6, and then a4. Black brought his rook to d8. White took on b5, reducing the number of pawns he has to worry about on the queen side, and white played his bishop to b2. Well, I think perhaps white should have taken on d8 in this position. It's hard to just let the other guy have the open file like this, but that does give white some command over the position. But even here, it's not that nice for white. Black's still better after bishop e3, knight d5. There's no doubt about that. But bishop b2 puts the bishop on a square where, if you are never able to get this pawn moving with e6, the bishop's just on a passive square. So black took on d1. White recaptured with the queen. Slightly surprising move. But if he takes back with the rook, we're going knight d5. And if he goes rook d2, we're going knight b4. And then we're going to put our rook on a2. White's got a couple of weaknesses to look after. The b3 pawn. And black's also got ideas of queen to f5 and queen to b1. So perhaps that explains why white took back with the queen. Black went rook d8, queen c2, and now black went queen d5, taking full control of the centre. White went h3, and now black put his queen in on d3. So this is more or less a very thematic type of position that could occur in this line, with the pieces coming off and black getting this endgame advantage. He's getting his queenside pawn majority going before white can ever muster any counterplay on the king side. So essentially, white is worse in this position. It's probably not lost, but it's pretty uncomfortable. Knight e4 was played, and knight b4 was the reply. If rook takes b3 in this position, that's also a very good move. I presume black didn't do this because knight takes c5. When after takes, there's a mutual piece position here. The bishop's hanging, so is the knight. But I think knight f4 is starting to look very good for black, even here in this simplified situation. White's got some problems here with his bishop. But knight b4 may be even better, going back to the game. Rook c3, rook check, king h2, and now black puts his knight in on d3. This looks very, very strong. White's got to spend some time protecting his bishop. Rook b1 was played, and now white played a good move, a rescuing move here, rook d2. Bit of a surprise. He's allowing him to take on b2, but white's idea is that the knight is trapped over there on b2. So knight c3 was answered by bishop to g5. Knight takes b1, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, and now again, pressing on thematically, black went c4. Knight endings tend to be very much like pawn endings, and the outside passed pawn in this position should really give black a winning game. Knight b3. Well, obviously white can't take the knight, and if he plays knight f3, I think black's just going to push that pawn. White is losing material in this position, whatever happens. So knight b3 was answered by knight takes e5 and king g3 by f6. This is move 39, close to the time control. Perhaps cleaner in this position was knight to d3. And if king f3, knight to e1. The point of this is to force white to play king g3 to avoid further material loss. And now, only now, does black start to bring his king across. After f6 as played, white gets a little bit of play after king f4 and then king e4, but black is still up to the task of winning this position. He played b4, f4, and the knight came to g6. Now white played g3, and black brought his knight to e7, and white went knight to d4. g6 was answered by g4, and now black played f5. Another good move, and the first point of it is that if white takes, black takes back with the knight. This should be winning for black. It can create confusion and activity on the king side before white can ever take the pawn off on b4. And if knight c6, well, we just push on with b3. So after f5, king d3 was played. Black took on g4. I think we can see what's coming. At some point, black is going to play h5, and that's a second outside pass pawn. But first of all, black played a tidying up move, knight d5. again forcing the white king to an inferior square. And now, with everything complete, the preparations are ready for this move h5, and that really is the death blow. The knight can't defend against two passed pawns. Well, white's split. I mean, his king's got to look after one passed pawn, his knight's got to look after the other. Let's see what happens. G takes h5, king g3, knight d5, and the point of this is that after king h4, knight takes f4, king g5, we've got knight e6 check winning. So black is working with tactics. If white goes f5, we go king f6, and king h4 is answered by knight f4, and if king g3, we go king g5, and again that leads to a position of zugzwang. So not an easy position for white. Lost. He went king f3, king f6, knight b3, knight e7, king e4, h4, knight comes back to d4. Again, white's got to drop his king back, but then knight f5, something like this, king e6, and this position. Now we play the crushing move, king d5. If king takes f5, h3, winning. You can see now the problem for white with these two outside passed pawns, and otherwise white hasn't got a move in this position. So, really difficult. Back to the game, white played knight d4, h3 was played knight f3, and now b3, and that was the last move of the game. Let me just show you the winning technique. If white goes king d3, king f5, king c3, king takes f4, knight h2, and now we move in with the knight. Bang. Lovely. And that's the way to do it. So, a very interesting game, a very good game by Van den Duel, a good fight throughout, and our first experience after queen b8 of d5. I think that's a move which you're going to have to expect quite often when you play this line. The critical position arises when everything gets taken off, knight takes, everything gets taken off on this square, and after e4, knight b6, then white has the choice of where to put his rook. Remember the idea in this line, wherever white does put his rook, of queen to c8, and then either queen to e6 or maybe queen to g4, dependent on circumstances.